Welcome back to the second seminars in the series of seminars on the First War in this room. And we're nearing the end of a very long and very interesting series. I'm very glad to introduce the next speaker, Pierre Purseigle, and his topic, which is, I think, of particular interest to Norwegians, and the idea of coming from being part of a Nordic model of a strong modern state, which you could argue was born in the First World War. In a very famous quote by the British historian A.J.P. Taylor, he said that before the First World War, a law-abiding Englishman could pass through life and hardly notice the existence of the state beyond the post office and the policeman. All this, says Taylor, was changed by the impact of the Great War. And this transformation of the state and its role in the life of the ordinary citizen is the topic for today's lecture by Pierre. He is one of the co-founders, as you can see up there, of the International Society for the First World War Studies. Furthermore, he's currently a Marie Curie Fellow at Yale University, as you can see up there, and he's an Associate Professor at the University of Warwick in the UK, for those who don't know. He has also several publications on the First World War, and he is currently co-editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of World War I, nonetheless. And I believe that this is sort of a test run for an article which will be published very soon. So with no further ado, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Nick. I'm going to try to plug in my thing. There you go. Right. Well, first of all, I should like all colleagues I've done before me to sincerely thank the organizers and Friedrich for this wonderful opportunity for us to come to Norway and discuss the state of First War studies, and of course for your very generous hospitality. It's a great pleasure to be here in the company of many friends and distinguished colleagues. Some of them have, of course, dealt with some of the issues that I'm going to be discussing. Now, I'm lucky enough that I'm speaking, in particular, right after Jay Winter's lectures that dealt with some of the issues I was planning to discuss. As Nick said, and I'm very grateful for his use of A.J.P. Taylor's quote. I mean, in a sense, what I want to ask is, what did the state look like in 1914, 1918 for belligerent societies? Post office? An English Bobby? This might be seemingly a very simple question, but this is where, as we all know, this is where we get into pretty complex responses. And again, as Nick hinted, this is really the first iteration of a reflection I'm trying to conduct on the transformations of the war of the state in the First World War. This is based on an article that's coming out next week in International Affairs, the Chatham House Journal. And if you want a copy, I shouldn't say this actually, but if you want to have a look at what the argument looks like in printed form, please go on the website, download the article, and so on and so forth, or just talk to me after the lecture. Right. And I should also say that none of those institutions present on this slide will ever take any responsibility for what I ever say in public. And good for them. Now, just a starting point, we could do worse perhaps than using the two quotes that I've put up here on this slide. Two quotes from two very different scholars working at two very different times. The first one, Heinrich von Streich, writing about the war in Berlin in late 19th century. A man known certainly by many in the audience for his particular blend of militaristic, anti-Semitic, and authoritarian nationalism. And he's basically underlining the role that war played in the emergence and consolidation of the modern state. And it has indeed become a common trope in historical and social scientific literature to claim, as Charles Tilly, the late Charles Tilly, of course, a giant of historical sociology, as Tilly put it, that war makes states and vice versa. And of course, students and scholars of the First World War have long recognized the role that the state played in leading, in organizing, in managing the mobilization of belligerent societies for the persecution of war. And of course, after the guns fell silent in 1918, historians, scholars attempted to make sense of an experience which has effectively transformed and challenged a conventional understanding of the relationship between the business of modern war and the organization of modern civil society. I mean, one such example is a celebrated French historian of Britain, Elia Lévy, who went to Oxford in 1929 to present his first iteration of his analysis of the First World War. And he did so before an audience at a particular time in 1921, where many of his colleagues and like-minded scholars were really anxious to salvage liberalism from the ruins of war. And he went back to this topic in November 1936 before the French Society of Philosophy to elaborate on what he went on to call, what he called then, the Era of Tyrannies. And I'm not going to read the slide, but for Lévy, the Era of Tyrannies starts in 1914 and is effectively defined, characterized by the new role that the state played in social life. It's increased control of economic life, economic activity, characterized as well by the emergence of a new form of corporatism, whereby business elites as well as trade unions got involved together in running running the national economy, but also in the intellectual and cultural sphere, a moment defined by state control of public opinion, by the suppression of dissent, and by what he called, in a very revealing turn of phrase, the organization of enthusiasm. Now, this is very clearly an analysis which is tainted by the emergence of the USSR and by the rise of fascism. And what is interesting in this particular case is that here we have a liberal historian that basically ends up setting little store by civil society, by the role of civil society in wartime. Now, the social and political legacy of total war exercised historians and philosophers, but also exercised military commanders. And a good example of such military commanders trying to think about the political impact of the war is no less than Erich von Ludendorff, who, as you know, really never accepted the defeat of Germany in 1918 and his own part and his own role in the collapse of the German army. And he obviously, when he writes Der Totalkrieg in 1935, is thinking about how he's going to, how Germany is potentially going to win the next war. And for him, essentially, he argues that in order to win the next war, you're going to have to establish a military dictatorship. Now, it would be very difficult to find two commentators, two analysts, whose frames of reference would be as alien to each other as Lévy and Ludendorff. But what is very interesting is that they both stress the critical centrality of the state in the process of mobilization, and this is something I want to look at, because of course the First War revealed the state's capacity to mobilize the belligerents' resources to great effect, irrespective of the specificities of their political system, and to an extent irrespective of the outcome of the war, even though of course the role that state played in the mobilization process had a direct impact, as Jay Winter mentioned earlier, on the outcome of the war. Now, very quickly, how have historians and scholars written the history of the wartime state? That chronology, as it were, roughly corresponds to the one presented by Jay earlier. Perhaps not as neat a chronology as the one that is suggested, but there's clearly a link. From 1914, from the very period of the war, scholars concentrated on the war's impact on political regimes, on the belligerents' institutional arrangements and structures. And of course, they were largely concerned with the unprecedented degree of state intervention in economic life. A very good example are the volumes published under the aegis of the Carnegie Endowment right after the war. Now, here, of course, what struck scholars is the fact that even states as committed to liberalism as Britain was in 1914 ended up taking control of essential industries. For instance, in the UK, of course, the railways in 1914, steel and coal production in 1916, 1917. After 1945, after the 1940s, generally speaking, scholars tended to be more focused on the type of corporatism that emerged out of the war experience, or rather during the war itself. So what we're saying is that effectively, up until the late 1970s, the political history of the war, indeed the political and economic history of the war, largely revolved around the mobilization of the coercive power of the state, as historians, unsurprisingly, drew on Max Weber's work. Now, since the late 1980s, and the emergence and consolidation of cultural history as the dominant paradigm in First War studies, it seems to me that the historiography has sort of shifted the emphasis away from the state to underline the agency of belligerent populations. And perhaps as a result, the study of the state in wartime has relatively suffered, while, of course, the field as a whole prospered as historians really paid attention and directed their attention to new objects and mobilize new methods. Now, to a large extent, this is an attempt that sort of responds directly to the suggestion that Jay made, and that's not going to surprise those of you who know me. I've had the privilege to work with Jay since I was a graduate student, and I started out as an urban historian trying to look at the same time both below the nations, by looking at the urban experience, but also beyond the nation by offering a sort of comparative urban history of the war. And there's a very important point that I really take to heart in what Jay said earlier about the fact that history is a dialogue with previous historians, but as you will see, hopefully, in this, or at least that's the way I conceive this piece of work, a dialogue with those who actually went through the experience of war and who attempted to think about it, to analyze it. So it's also an invitation, and I think it's a reminder that we should always be rather humble when we look at the First World War and go back to what people have been writing, because an awful lot of very interesting, very sophisticated analysis have already been provided, and we just tend to forget that a great deal of amazing work has been done by the people who went for this experience. Now, what I'm going to do is make a series of propositions, and this, I mean, I'm in it when I say propositions, because again, this is the sort of first articulation of some of those ideas that I'm going to be pursuing for the Oxford Handbook of World War I, and hopefully in maybe another publication. Unsurprisingly, I'm going to focus on three main aspects: on violence and coercion, on solidarity, and on sovereignty. And basically, I've got two, beyond this attempt to look at the transformation of the states, I've got two larger objectives here. It's first to sort of bridge the gap that still remains between the military and social and cultural histories of the war, to integrate the experience of the front lines and the experience of the home fronts in a common analytical framework. And the second objective is to consolidate the comparative transnational analysis of the war by challenging the centrality of the nation state as a category of analysis. And paradoxically, perhaps, I'm going to try to do this by actually looking at the nation state. Okay. So this is part of the larger endeavor to bring the state back into our historiographical discussion, and mainly because the transformations of the state testify to the impact of industrialized warfare on the political structure of belligerent societies. That's part of the larger reflection on the changing, of what historians call the changing character of war. Now, the first thing that I should say before going on is first to stress the profound differences between the political systems involved in the war, okay? And I'm not trying to flatten, as perhaps we're always tempted to do when we do comparative international history. I'm really trying not to flatten differences between different systems. I mean, just look at the countries involved in the two main alliances. You know, on the one hand, you've got a constitutional monarchy with Britain, allied to a universalist, centralized republic, France, and then, of course, the two sort of liberal democratic regimes are allied to the Russian Empire. That is, of course, an autocratic regime whose Tsar, like is Austro-Hungarian counterpart, reigned by the grace of God. The German Kaiserreich combine, interestingly, authoritarian and parliamentarian structures. So we get this uneasy coexistence between a reactionary emperor and a parliament, Reichstag, elected on one of the widest franchise in the world at the time. Now, in discussing how the Great War ushered in fundamental transformations of politics in these different contexts, I'm nonetheless going to stress the commonality of the challenges issued by industrialized warfare. So I'm going to be talking of the belligerent state as a sort of shorthand to talk about the responses these different states came up with during the war. But again, I try to keep their specificities very much in mind. So I'm going to address, or this work address, first two critical aspects of the relationship between the wartime state and civil society. The deployment of coercion, first, and the expression of national solidarity. And what I want to suggest is how the logic of mass participation in modern warfare transformed both the contours of the state, what the state looked like, but also the very foundations of the state. In other words, looking at the transformation of the state during the war gives us a way to perhaps better understand its subsequent transformations. Because these transformations were not simply the result of the pragmatic adoption of contingent and reversible policies, but the First World War contributed to a redefinition of the sources of state authority and redefined sovereignty. Now, what I'm going to do is mainly concentrate on the first and the third part of this argument, largely because both David and Jay this morning made many of the points, and actually that I would have made and made them way better than I could ever hope to. So I'll just sort of run through this in the interest of time. And I'm going to start with violence and coercion. And this is where we are sort of compelled, for obvious and very good reasons, to go back to Max Weber, to go back to his famous 1919 lecture, Politics as Vocation, where a lecture in which he offered his famous definition of the state as the community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. I mean, the one definition of the state that every single undergraduate will have had, drilled into his or her skull. So legitimate coercion is at the core of the Weberian state, along with a bureaucratic administration supported by a centralized fiscal state. Now, the reason why it's important to go back to Weber is that it's a direct response to the First World War. It's a thesis elaborated at that very moment So that makes it an indispensable starting point, I think. But the point that I'm going to try to make in the first section is that however useful a definition that is, it perhaps obscure the actual historical experience or historical nature of the wartime state. And the first question that I want to pose is that of the monopoly of legitimate coercion. And I'm going to make what I think is a rather simple and obvious point, is that in practical terms, mass military mobilization brought about the devolution of the means of coercion. In arming millions of their citizens, the warring states effectively challenged their own monopoly of the means of violence. Now, unwittingly, perhaps somebody like Trajka himself acknowledged as much when he averred that, and I quote, the very constitution of a state rests upon the distribution of weapons among people. Now, don't get me wrong, he was no Democrat, okay? But he nonetheless, got his finger on something which is very important. Now, the degree of military mobilization, as you all know, varied greatly among Belgians, but on average, we're looking at 30% of the overall male population between the ages of 15 and 49. So the First War in this respect constitutes a remarkable historical situation. I'm going to take just one dramatic example, the French mutinies of 1917, because I think they shed light on the particular nature of the constitution of the state. For in this context, soldiers in arms who had effectively been entrusted with the means of legitimate violence refused unquestioning obedience to the state's bidding. And here, of course, I'm building on the remarkable study of the French mutinies by Len Smith, which is one of my favorite books ever in this field. I think it's just absolutely brilliant. And what Smith revealed is how the mutineers called upon their identity as citizen soldiers, but they also called upon a conception of popular sovereignty inherited from the French Revolution to challenge military authorities. And perhaps paradoxically, what is interesting is that we could argue that the mutineers literally and paradoxically embodied the state. So when you think about what the state looked like in 1914, 1918, it may actually look like, a rather drunk-looking French mutineers in 1917. Now, recent historical works have also demonstrated the extent to which Weber actually misunderstood the nature of discipline of the armed forces. There's some interesting passages in his Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft about this, but he presents military discipline as a sort of purely rational and impersonal mechanism to obtain obedience. And of course, what historians of the war have demonstrated, and I guess Edwards hinted at this as well, is that leadership and command are defined as a relationship, whether unequal, whether informed by class and cultural prejudices it may have been. And indeed, one of the points I'm going to try to stress, that I've stressed in my first book, and I'm keeping at it, I guess, is that the mobilization of belligerent societies relied both in the front lines and on the home fronts on the conditional and decentralized process. Let me take another example. And we can, to do this, we can look at this sort of rather idiosyncratic ways in which Britain managed conscription after 1916. And we can look at the military tribunals created by the Military Service Act of 1916 that established conscription. Now, these tribunals that look very much like the local recruitment boards set up in the US in June 1917, they had been put in place to consider appeals against conscription lodged by individuals, their families, or businesses. And what we have there is basically an interesting site in which there's arbitration between the demands of the military, where agents of the state are pursuing military manpower in the face of opposition of individuals, families, and local businesses. In the meantime, and what's interesting, of course, is that conscription is seen not only in the British context, but as the perfect illustration, the perfect symbol of the state coercive powers. Okay, and yet its operation was a bit more complicated than this. Now, in the American experience of the war also demonstrate that the wartime state relied on civil society organization and local elite to implement conscription and to enforce norms of patriotic behavior. And you could also look at the experience of military mobilization in the Ottoman Empire, where despite its authoritarian and centralizing tendency, the Ottoman state, had to rely on local communities as well. Now I'm going to have to speed up a bit because I don't want to keep you here for too long. I'm the last thing standing between you and lunch, and that, to a Frenchman, is quite something. Bureaucratic administration. Now, the societies that went to war in August 1914 sought to bring the resources of industrial societies to bear on the battlefield. And of course, the war itself is a product of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. That's a very well-known point. But as David mentioned yesterday, of course, industrialist warfare produced and created its own pressures, and in particular in the area of logistics, which I think is a rather understudied area. Armies needed dense logistical networks to support them, to supply them. But the challenge of economic mobilization, or the mobilization in support of these armies, was not simply one of scale. It was also one of sophistication. Wealth was necessary, but not sufficient. Technological and scientific know-how and organizational skills were also required to match the political will to enact a swift and profound, if temporary, transformation of the national economy. And here what we see is that the state basically had to go and basically get the resources, the human resources, the know-how, the capacity to do this, had to go to civil society organization, had to go to businesses, of course, this is very well known, but also to trade unions in order to manage this. So you've got very different types of relationship established during the war, of course, from strict control to flexible partnership. And the attitude of the state was dictated by circumstances. And circumstances, if not always goodwill, imposed cooperation. So the first thing that we see is the interdependence, or the dependence of the state on civil society in order to mobilize the nation. And that points to something which I think is quite important. Points to a rather, well, pragmatic, in fact, functional approach to the state. And a good example, perhaps, is France here, where you have a universalist, centralized state that is traditionally very reluctant to engage in any positive way, still to this day, with civil society organizations, a great deal of mistrust, political mistrust. But what you see here is that the French state adopted a very pragmatic approach to civil society, and sort of chimes in with what Léon Duguay, a very important social theorist and legal thinker at the time, argued that effectively the modern state was, in the era of the First World War, better understood not as a set of coercive institutions, but as a provider of public services. I'm just going to read the final sentence. The state ceases to be an authority that orders to become a group that works. Okay, and I think that's a fairly important point. Fiscal state, I mean, this is sort of, a final leg of the Weberian definition. The point that I want to make here, and we all know how important taxation was in funding, borrowing, but also taxation were important in funding the war effort. But what is very interesting is that what you see is a sort of expansion of the principles of taxation into civil society. And the idea is that if you look at, as I've done, at voluntary schemes of charitable contributions, particularly when it came to supporting war victims as well as combatants, those schemes of charitable contribution were underpinned by a rhetoric of political obligation and patriotic service that defined citizenship in strong ethical terms, but that sort of reorients the rhetoric of taxation. This is what Chris Capozzola called, with reference to the American context, coercive voluntarism. And I think this applies to a range of other contexts. Now, solidarity, this is the second this is the second element that I'm going to go over quite quickly again, because other colleagues have addressed many other points I wanted to make. The idea here is that the study of coercion and domination does not, whether important it is, because it clearly is, does not exhaust the political history of the war and the analysis of the wartime state. Because the belligerent state was called upon to preserve and guarantee the solidarity of the nation in arms. So it's important to look at the way states went about doing this. And this is one of the ways in which we can bring the cultural history of the war back into this discussion of the wartime state. I mean, effectively, and Jay hinted at this earlier, the state was expected to allocate material resources in an equitable manner and to adjudicate the claims of competing interest groups. So if you look at the mobilization of manpower, if you look at the allocation of food and other essential supplies, sacrifice and justice are the two most important concepts. And those are defined during the war through a range of social movements and struggles that are very important to bring back into the history of wartime mobilization. Because effectively what social groups and individuals did through social movements, through this claim making, was basically to articulate the conditions of their commitment to the war effort. I think we tend to, and I'm going to go back to this point in a minute. We often tend to equate successful wartime mobilization with consensus. In fact, there's no consensus. There's no consensus in 1914. But it doesn't mean that people don't actually support the war, but they all support the war for very different reasons. I mean, if you even look at strikers on the Clyde in 1916, 15 and 16, they actually accused profiteers in the government because they reckon they're not patriotic enough. Because we workers on strike are the real patriots here. Okay, and you see this argument, you're always somebody else's profiteer, you're always somebody else's shirker, and you're always the better patriot of the two. So I think it's important to look at social movements in a very different way, and strikes in a different way, not as a crisis of national mobilization, but as an essential part of the process of mobilization. I'm going to end for this section here and move on. But the point that Jay made earlier is that the material resources, know-how, and the exercise of authority of the state were essential to wartime mobilization, of course. But the success and sustainability also depended on the maintenance of the legitimacy of the war effort. And this is where you have a very important link between the legitimacy of the war, the legitimacy of the way the war is managed, and the legitimacy of the state itself. And this brings me to a discussion of sovereignty. In the immediate aftermath of the conflict, in 1919-1920, the anthropologist Marcel Mauss set out to write a very ambitious study of the state that, interestingly, he entitled The Nation. He never completed the book, but significant parts were published in 1940, so this is what we've got. And he very clearly saw little point in distinguishing state and nation, and he defined the sovereign body politic as the assembly of all citizens. Now, to an extent, you look at this and, well, that's a very French way to look at the nation. But more argument is that the war actually brought about redefinition of sovereignty in many other national contexts. So this is what I want to end with, a discussion of this notion of sovereignty, because the war challenged and redefined the sources of political authority. Now, definition, there's a very good one that I'm using of sovereignty by R.P. Wolf here. It's the right to command and correlatively the right to be obeyed. The reason why I think this is a very important definition is because it shows that sovereignty, like power, is a relationship. It is not a thing, something that you have. It is a relationship. And in 1914, 1918, the authority of the state rested, as we've seen, on its capacity to wage war without undermining the living standards of its mobilized citizenry. So the legitimacy of the state was intimately bound up with the way it prosecuted war. And this is central to Weber's work as well. I mean, the idea that legitimacy is not some kind of abstract quality, but something you can observe. Something you can observe because you see it when governments, when states engage in making claims on the nation by, asking people to pay taxes, for instance, or to perform military service. And claim making, and this is an argument that I make in my book, is critically important to wartime mobilization, because as I've said earlier, belligerent populations constantly define their contributions to the war effort through negotiation and bargaining. And of course, existing political cultures in different national contexts provided the framework for this negotiation. Just to give you an example of how those debates about the allocation of resources played out in some contexts. This is what Charles Taylor and political scientists would refer to as adjudication of different claims. What happened when the state is asking societies to provide it with soldiers? We've seen a good, interesting example in the British case with local military tribunals, where we see that the state did not always get its way, even when it came to a very fundamental aspect of wartime mobilization. But if you look at Germany, if you look at the implementation of the Hindenburg program by the Third OHL, now here you've got a plan for the authoritarian mobilization of the nation's resources. But even there, the Third OHL had to come to terms with the growing importance of organized labor and what some scholars call the certain parliamentarization of the German system of government. And then effectively, what is stressed is that it was critically important for the state to secure the consent of key groups in civil societies, and in particular, of course, of organized labor. So throughout the war, social conflicts, as I said, including strikes and other forms of petitioning, enable belligerent societies to articulate the conditions of their commitment to the war efforts. At the front, soldiers' resistance to discipline, including mutinies, is one example of this process. And indeed, the logic of mass participation in warfare contributed to the extension and gradual, if often limited, empowerment of citizenry. As Charles Taylor pointed out, the relationship between war making and civilian politics had altered fundamentally. In fact, the war experience dramatically reinforced the terms of the social contract to which citizenship refers. The continuing process of negotiation and bargaining thus manufactured popular consent to war effort, elaborated as much through struggles and conflict as through outspoken support. There's some interesting work, like an unpublished dissertation that I read recently, on petitions filed by Russian peasants during the war. And that actually demonstrates the sophistication of that process of claim making. And what it shows is that what the Russian case underline, I think, is the necessity to differentiate between the contestation of state policies and the rejection of national solidarity. In fact, if you look at the work of Josh Sanborn on the military mobilization of the Russian Empire, what it shows is that those claims and even those rejection of state policies were often framed in national terms. So you can reject what the state is doing. It doesn't mean you're rejecting the war. It doesn't mean you're rejecting the nation. So what does this mean for sovereignty? Sovereignty, not so much as a notion, but as a practice, as it were. And I promise I'm gonna shut up soon. This shows what the war is about, I think. And as Michael Geyer put it brilliantly, I think, the issue in great wars and the cause for profound crisis is not governability of ways of military reasoning, but the nature of the government and military reason itself. So it's no surprise that political theorists in that period, in the immediate aftermath of the war, elaborated new conceptions of sovereignty. And one chief example of this is Carl Schmitt, of course, that continues to attract an awful lot of commentary for all sorts of reasons. Now, very briefly, and I certainly wouldn't pretend to be an expert on Carl Schmitt's theories, but he articulated his theory of sovereignty around the situation of exception and emergency. As he put it in 1922, the sovereign is he who decides on the exceptions. And of course, that's a rejection of, his own work and his career under the Nazi regime shows this as well. He rejected liberal democracy, constitutionalism, and effectively identified sovereignty in the capacity to suspend the current legal regime in response to an emergency. Now, what I think the First War shows is just how wrong he was. And you can just look at the experience of Germany, I believe, to make this point, because the plurality and dynamism of German civil society contrasted with a political system which, although not unreformed, and resisted greater popular participation and allowed the concentration of, some have argued, dictatorial powers in the hands of the Army Supreme Command. And yet what you see from 1914 is a great deal of debate about what the national community really is about, this debate about the ideas of 1914. If you look like Benjamin Seaman has done at social movements in which women in particular played a prominent role, what you see are discourses of political participations that are articulated, as Jay mentioned, around notions of rights and entitlements. And finally, if you look at the collapse, a bit like the 1917 French mutinies, if you look at the collapse of the German army, is what Wilhelm Dies called the Covert Strike, what this shows is that if the sovereign is to be defined by its capacity to suspend the current legal regime in response to an emergency, as Schmitt argues, sovereignty clearly was in the hands of the mobilized citizenry. And of course, that chimes in with Ludendorff's own attempt to sort of, turn the clock back and return to, it's a very reactionary attempt to go back to the status quo antebellum, literally. But what the First War showed is that despite its best effort, the state could not successfully claim a monopoly on sovereignty. In fact, the logic of mass participation in wartime constrained the state, even while it enabled it to act in an unprecedented way, because its very legitimacy depended on its capacity to uphold, I'm not going to talk about a social contract, but a social compact that was now redefined by the sacrifice of soldiers and civilians alike. And as the state made claims over civil society in the name of national defense, both combatants and civilians increasingly invoked popular sovereignty to make claims upon the state. Final point, war as revolution. That's the point that Elia Levy himself made back in his 1929 lecture at Oxford. And of course, the war brought down, the German, Austrian, Hungarian, Russian, Ottoman empires. Of course, that's the pretty obvious point to make. This war is also a revolution. But across the belligerent world, from Washington to Beijing, post-war social movements challenged established political, racial, gendered, and social hierarchies. And in the eyes of these protesters, the Great War demonstrated the need for a redefinition of the contours of the national citizenry. The enfranchisement of, it's one of those words in English I've always struggled for. I don't know why. You people should all speak French. I think that would make my life so much easier. If you look at female enfranchisement, anyway, right after the war, you see that that basically underlines this assimilation of national and popular sovereignty. But if you look at post-war constitution, you see some very interesting things. In Austria, of course, there's an established a democratic republic, and the constitution proclaims its law, and I quote, its law emanates from the people. Let's take another defeated power, the Ottoman Empire, and the 1924 Constitution of Turkey, that affirm, and I quote, sovereignty belongs without restriction to the nation. So you can see the shift. But the constitution of the Weimar Republic also attests to the rather ambivalent character of this transition. Indeed, if you take its very first article, it states, and I quote, the German Reich is a republic. state authority derives from the people. And that, I think, illustrates the rather awkward combination of traditional and modern form of sovereignties. To misquote Arno Meyer, the persistence of the Ancien Régime in the interwar period testifies to the highly contested and contingent nature of this transition. So what this does, underscoring the subversive character of the war, also allows us to bring the post-war revolutions back into the story of the war that transformed the meaning and practice of sovereignty in recognition of what Peter Olquist, a historian of Russia, identified as a European continuum of war, civil war, and revolution. I was planning to end with another radical liberal critique of the wartime state, Randolph Bourne. But the point that I want to make is that what the First War really underlines is the interdependence of state and civil society. It underlines the fact that the war cannot be merely apprehended in institutional terms because the state itself is a social formation. The logic of mass participation, as I've said, transformed the relationship between individuals and groups to the state. And it did so largely in contingent and pragmatic way. But in doing so, it affected the political and ethical underpinnings of the state's legitimacy. So in challenging monolithic and centralized conception of state authority, the social history of the conflict, I think, can further our understanding of the transformation of the state in the First War. Thank you.